Okay, hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you're joining us from. Today, I want you to know I am thrilled to tell you that I am hosting this webinar from my birth country, Panama. And that's why you see my beautiful Panamanian flag in the back, my Panamanian outfit, and I am so thrilled to be able to host this webinar from my home country, Panama. Okay, all that said, we are so excited that you are joining us today. Welcome, welcome. As everybody's logging in, please use the chat function, as I see several people are doing, to let us know where you're joining us from. We are delighted to welcome each one of you to our webinar today titled Interpreting for Gender and Sexual Diversity. My name is Analia, and I am the manager of training and curriculum here at Cross Cultural Communication, the largest international training agency for community, educational, and medical interpreting. I will be again your host for today's 1 hour webinar. Also, with us today, behind the scenes, is my colleague Andrew Hall, Cross-Cultural Communications Publications Manager. Andrew will manage the chat and will provide useful information throughout the webinar. Thank you so much, Andrew. I couldn't do it without you. Before we begin though, and as we wait for everybody else to come online, I would like to share with you some of our updates here at CCC. Okay, here's a good one. Discover the tools you need for an effective setup and learn how to grow your skills to meet the needs of an evolving profession in our latest self-paced online course, the Remote Interpreter Online Module 1. This highly interactive 8-lesson course covers how technology has impacted the interpreting field and why remote interpreting is here to stay. The Remote Interpreter Online Module 1 is available for purchase now, and my colleague Andrew is going to post on the chat if you are interested where you can go. Okay, a little bit more about this. This course is based on the first volume of our groundbreaking publication, The Remote Interpreter, an international textbook released earlier this year. Written for individuals and organizations training and working anywhere in the world, this textbook offers a comprehensive investigation of the skills and practices you need to be an effective interpreter in remote settings. To learn more about and purchase the Remote Interpreter, an international textbook, Andrew will post on the chat the link. Lastly, last but not least, I am thrilled to tell you that we have a new book called Introduction to Educational Interpreting and Translation. It is full of tips and useful information for interpreters and translators working in the USA education system. We're now taking pre-orders in case you're interested in this book. And if you would like to learn more about it, Andrew will put a link on the chat right now as well. Right? Okay, now I will go over a few points regarding the webinar. As always, the webinar presentation will last between 40 to 45 minutes by a 15 to 20-minute QA period, during which you can ask any questions you have to our presenter. During the webinar, please keep the Q&A feature open and use the Q&A to submit questions that you have for the presenter. For other comments or questions for us here at Cross Cultural Communications, please use the chat feature instead. And if you want everyone to see any comments that you have, please make sure that your chat is set to everyone. Lastly, if you want to stay on after our presenter leaves at the end of the hour and you have any questions for Andrew and myself, we will be happy to answer any questions about cross-cultural communications and Horizon. Important information, this webinar has been approved for CEUs. We're thrilled to say that. Please remember that 24 hours after the webinar, attendees will be mailed a link to download the certificate of attendance. That will be 24 hours after the webinar ends. It will go to the same email that you used to register for this webinar. Please check your spam or junk folder if you don't see it. Certificates are only available for attendees of the live session of this webinar. Please remember, you must download these certificates within 2 months of today's session. So February 13th at the latest, we will not be able to send any certificates. They will go automatically to you. So you have 2 months to download those certificates. Now, without further ado, let's begin our webinar, Interpreting for Gender and Sexual Diversity. And I want to welcome our presenter, Kelly. So let me tell you a little bit about Kelly. Kelly Henriquez is a dual certified Spanish medical healthcare interpreter in Richmond, Virginia. She acquired her BA from Virginia Commonwealth University with a concentration in Spanish and completed their Spanish-English translation and interpretation program. Kelly began her career in language services as a bilingual patient advocate at a local safety net clinic and has since then been interpreting on site in both medical and mental health facilities. During the pandemic, she began her YouTube channel for interpreters in an effort to provide free and accessible continuing education. And Kelly, thank you. I just want you to know that. Thank you, because this is amazing. Okay, shortly after, she also became a medical interpreter training with American Against Language Barriers and was recently recognized as the 2023 Americans Against Language Barriers Educator of the Year. So kudos to you, Kelly. Welcome, Kelly. I'm going to disappear, and Kelly, the floor is yours. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Analia. Oh my goodness, isn't Analia gorgeous today with her traditional Panamanian outfit? I love it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with you all. Let me make sure I have, oops, it looks like I'm a slide too far. Sorry about that, y'all. Give me just 1 second. It's not a live webinar unless you have technical difficulties, right? All right, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. All righty. So as Analia stated, I will be presenting to you all on an incredibly important topic, interpreting for gender and sexual diversity. So again, I'm super, super grateful to Cross Cultural Communications for allowing me to present on this incredibly important topic today. I did just want to let everyone know that I have been a little under the weather. So there may potentially be a point during the webinar where I might need to mute myself and turn my camera off very briefly. So if that happens, don't worry, I will be back. I just might need to cough or something like that. But I'm here and the show must go on. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So I would really, really appreciate it if maybe you could get out a sheet of notebook paper or maybe open up your word processor and start a document and start taking notes on terms that you're unfamiliar with, because there are going to be some terms. Hopefully, I'll introduce you to a term or some terms that'll be new to you. If you're unable to jot down the definition of that term during the presentation, no worries. There will actually be resources provided to you I believe, if I'm not mistaken, by Andrew in the chat, links to resource pages on my website with resources for further learning. So I wanted to start off talking about why I call this presentation what I call it. So when I say gender and sexual diversity, I'm talking about who most people refer to as the LGBT community. So we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. That's what LGBT stands for. However, you may sometimes see under the bi plus umbrella, so the bisexual umbrella, sometimes you might see this term pansexual. And non-binary is sometimes included under the transgender umbrella. It has a little star because not all non-binary people consider themselves transgender. And in addition to that, never tell a person who's bi or pan, people who are bisexual or pansexual, that bisexuality and pansexuality are the same thing. They probably have very strong opinions about that. I did want to define bisexual. Now, this definition does vary among people who are bisexual, but I can tell you what my definition is because I'm bi. I'm attracted to people who are my gender and people who aren't my gender. The reason why I give this definition about this particular concept is because a lot of people like to define this as being attracted to men and women. But that's just not accurate for many people who are bisexual or bi. And so this highlights a really important point that definitions of these terms they will vary among people. Different people within each of these groups will define their sexuality and gender differently. I'm providing definitions during this presentation, not as absolute truths, but as a baseline for general understanding. So, first part of the acronym, LGBT. You might also see this one, LGBTQIA. We've first added here queer or questioning and intersex, which we'll go over later. We'll also go over the terms transgender and cisgender later. For now, I just wanted to talk about why I call the presentation what I call it. Asexual is an umbrella category, depending upon who you talk to. So someone who is asexual may say that they don't experience sexual attraction. And so here we have some related terms, demisexual and graysexual. I won't be getting into the definitions of these terms at this point because we only have 45 minutes, a lot of information to cover. You might also see, depending upon who you talk to, you might even be able to expand this acronym and these umbrella categories a little bit further. But we could spend a whole hour and a half on this, so I'm not going to. But again, you'll be provided with those resources to research to your heart's desire. And I do believe that Andrew had already pasted those links in the chat. So if you go back through the chat, you'll see those links. But Andrew, I would like to politely request that perhaps towards the end of the presentation as well, that those links be shared again, because I'm sure we're going to have a lot of messages in the chat. Now, it doesn't just end there. You might even see this acronym expanded a little bit further. So you might even see this one, LGBTQIA2SAA, in an effort not to exclude anyone. But this text does get pretty small in the slide, so let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. So let's look at the QQIP2SAA part. We have two Qs for queer and questioning. We have intersex again. Pansexual gets its own letter. 2S is for two-spirit, which is an umbrella of identities encompassing both gender and sexual diversity, as well as cultural roles and spiritual practices by many indigenous cultures. And the last two A's are for androgynous and asexual. But I could still give you a list, as long as my arm, going over what groups are still excluded from this acronym. So this is why I prefer to use the term gender and sexual diversity. I got to give credit where credit's due. I actually first heard about this term in a training by MODII. It's MODII. You can check them out at modii.org. And I absolutely love their trainings. They are in English, they are in Spanish. They offer a lot of their trainings for free, very educational and very useful for interpreters. So by using this term gender and sexual diversity, we're not leaving anyone out. We're covering different genders, sexualities, and the wonderful spectrum of sex characteristics. I just wanted to make sure you all understood why I use this name for my presentation. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. Modi.org. There it is. Ba-bam. You won't be able to click on it, but you can copy and paste it into your browser. I just put that in the chat for you. So now let's really get this show on the road. I know I've only explained why my presentation is called what it's called. So we're going to start with a couple of questions I'd like you to ask yourself. So all you have to do is consider whether you agree or disagree with each statement. You don't need to, you can answer in the chat if you'd like. I probably won't have an opportunity to read all of your responses in the chat because there are quite a few people here. But I just want you to consider this to yourself. When I'm interpreting, I should agree or disagree with each one of these statements. When I'm interpreting, I should remain impartial and not let my own personal beliefs affect the message. Agree or disagree? While you're thinking about that, I'm seeing a lot of folks agreeing in the chat. When I'm interpreting, I should be respectful of individuals, their communities, and their culture. Not sure if everyone's agreeing to this one or the one before, but getting an awful lot of responses of agree in the chat. The third one, when I'm interpreting, I should be familiar with a wide range of vocabulary and stay up to date on changes in my working languages. Like we're pretty much agreeing with all of these. And then the last one, when I'm interpreting, I should be accurate and complete in my renditions. Agree or disagree? I don't think I've ever seen the chat so on fire. And it looks like a lot of people are agreeing. So it seems we all agree about these things. So when it comes to this first little box here, impartiality, this is an ethical principle that is common across different different interpreting disciplines. I'm a medical interpreter, so sometimes I automatically refer to interpreting as medical interpreting, but I realize there's conference interpreting, legal interpreting, oh my goodness, educational interpreting, so many different types of interpreting. But this is an ethical principle that most disciplines of, I would say all disciplines of interpreting have in common. So impartiality, when it comes to impartiality, it doesn't matter if you think about it, whether you believe in or support gender and sexual diversity. That doesn't matter. That's honestly irrelevant. When I'm interpreting, I should be respectful of individuals, their communities, and their culture. So these have to do with, at least in medical interpreting, the ethical principles of respect and cultural awareness or cultural responsiveness. LGBTQIA plus people aren't an exception to respect. Culture is about more than what country someone is from, and many cultures embrace gender and sexual diversity. When it comes to being familiar with a wide range of vocabulary and staying up to date on changes in your language, that has to do with your professionalism, being a professional interpreter. And also professional development. Sometimes these are separated. But the thing is that people are going to talk about gender and sexuality. So you have to be prepared to interpret these things. And lastly, accuracy and completeness. If someone talks about gender or sexuality, you should interpret it accurately and completely. So I often hear interpreters will kind of disagree on, when it comes to the finer points of interpreting for gender and sexual diversity. And by no means am I trying to convince you that what I'm about to explain to you is correct or the only way of looking at things. I'm just here to make sure you understand these perspectives, which may be different from yours. That's it. And I will tell you, you will interpret for someone, whether it be a person with limited English proficiency, a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, an English speaker who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, questioning, pansexual, two-spirit, asexual, any one or more of the identities that fall under the umbrella of gender and sexual diversity. So now that we have some common ground established here, let's get started. I'm going to take a sip of water. So when we're born, we are assigned a sex. Now, this sex assignment at birth is primarily based on our external genitalia. So on the following slide, I will be using anatomically correct terms when referring to external genitalia. Just a heads up. So someone may be assigned female at birth. So this is an acronym that you may hear. Maybe you haven't heard it yet, but this is an acronym commonly used. AFAB or AFAB stands for assigned female at birth. So when someone is born with a vulva, we typically say, oh, it's a female, it's a girl. When someone is assigned male at birth, also known as AMAB or AMAB, someone is born with a penis. We look at them and we say, oh, it's a male, it's a boy. However, there are people who are born with sex characteristics, which may be genitals, could be their external genitalia, could be their gonads, so that would be their internal genitalia, and or chromosomal setups, gene expressions that don't fall neatly into male or female. Now, statistics say that about 2%, close to 2% of people in the world are born intersex. Not everyone may know that they're intersex. They could have physical sex characteristics that results in them being assigned female or assigned male at birth, but maybe they have chromosomes, maybe they have gonads or internal genitalia that don't line up nice and neatly with that. So 2%, we have about 600 people here. I'm bad at math. I'm an interpreter, I'm not a mathematician, but I would say we probably have a couple of dozen people here who, knowingly or not, might be intersex. So, sex is different from gender. I wanted to point that out, so we're going to talk about that. Sex is assigned at birth, usually based on external anatomy. So when it comes to gender, this is a social construct of norms, behaviors, and roles that vary between societies over time. So here in the US, when sex is assigned at birth, gender immediately gets assigned to. So again, like I said on the previous slide, born with a penis, oh, it's a male, it's a boy. Born with a vulva, oh, female, it's a girl. So here are some examples of some sex and gender terms. So sex, you'll typically see people refer to sex as male, female, or intersex. And then gender, boy, girl, man, woman, non-binary, gender non-conforming, two-spirit, mushe, hydra, and so many more. And so these terms, especially here, two-spirit, we're going to talk about, well, I believe we've already talked about this, but I think we're going to talk about it again. Mushe is in Mexico, and hydra is in India, and in the Indian subcontinent. But there are so many more. So when we're babies, we can't really speak up for ourselves. But at a certain point, we develop our sense of self. So this person was assigned male at birth, and then they say, okay, yeah, I'm a man. So this is what we call cisgender. Funny story, I once gave this presentation and I think I misspoke or I didn't enunciate clearly, and one person thought I said fish gender. And I got a question at the end, what's fish gender? Cisgender, C-I-S, cisgender. This isn't a dirty word or a bad word. Cis just means on the same side. So this person's gender matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, would we say this person identifies as a man? No, they're just a man. That's who they are. So next up, we have transgender. So this would be if the person is like, you know what, you may have assigned me male at birth, but I'm not a man. This person would be transgender. So trans means across. Translation means taking something from one language across the line over to another language. So transgender is crossing over the line from the gender you were assigned at birth to another gender. But man and woman, male and female, like I said when we were talking about assigning sex at birth, isn't as nice and neat and clear cut as we like to pretend it is. No, which brings us to our next term, non-binary. Someone can be neither a man nor a woman, somewhere in between or outside of them both completely. This person is non-binary. Non meaning non meaning not, bi meaning two, not the genders we try to limit people to. I'm going to be frank, I'm not here to argue the existence of non-binary people. I'm not here to tell you that you have to agree with it. I'm just explaining how many people in this world see gender. So some societies, like ours, tends to recognize just two genders, man and woman. This idea is called the gender binary. Now you'll see here on this, it's from a form, this image here. Sometimes you might see gender terms, sometimes you might see male and female also used as gender terms. That being said, societies and the consensuses they hold do evolve over time, just like language. There are many cultures that recognize genders outside of male and female, including many indigenous cultures that existed before the arrival of colonizers. These are just a few of the cultures, many of which, but not all, are indigenous or native, in which genders outside of the binary, man and woman, are part of the fabric of their culture and customs. Many of these cultures have had these customs for thousands of years, and in many cases, these gender customs are also tied to spiritual and religious functions. I did see some messages in the chat saying, how does this relate to interpretation? Well, much as we strive to take into account cultural differences when rendering our interpretations, so too should we take into account, well, the fact that non-binary genders are parts of many different cultures across the world, but also we should be taking into account what might be entirely different conceptualizations of things many of us take for granted or assume to be true. We can't impose our own cultural values on what we're interpreting. Otherwise, we're just not being impartial. So 1 in 4 LGBTQ youth in the United States use pronouns or pronoun combinations that fall outside of the binary construction of gender. One example of a non-binary pronoun, a pronoun that does not follow the gender binary, is the singular they. The singular they have been used for over 600 years as a gender-neutral singular pronoun in English. So I will say that in terms of usage, because I have seen some people being unsure of the usage of the singular they. So if you have the sentence, they are running, it could be a group of people running, or it could be a single person running. So if someone's pronouns are they, them, they are attending this webinar today. That's how we would refer to that person. We would use the same conjugation as we would use for the plural they, which of course I agree can be a little bit confusing, but context is very important. So when it comes to the singular gender neutral they, I often hear from many interpreters that their language is gendered, so they can't interpret gender neutral pronouns. I want to take a step back for a moment though, before we address this point, because I find that this can be a difficult discussion for some people to have when gender is involved. So we're going to remove gender from the equation for a moment. If you had to learn how to interpret construction terms, where would you look? And you're welcome to put this in the chat, where you would look for these construction terms. This is hopefully a topic that isn't as controversial or polarizing. I interpret a lot of workers' compensation assignments. A lot of the people I interpret for talk about their jobs in construction. They talk about titles, equipment, materials, you name it. So I'm seeing here Some people are saying Google, manuals, construction glossaries, let's see, or construction experts, okay, a specific industry dictionary. Let's see here, OSHA, specific glossaries, blogs, chats, a construction worker. This Old House, that was one of my mom's favorite shows growing up. She'd be like, oh, This Old House is on. So I really, really love the fact that, some of us have mentioned using some sources like maybe dictionaries and things like that. But I will say that I'd love to ask the Spanish speakers, if you don't mind, because I'm a Spanish interpreter. How did someone refer to themselves in Spanish if they're a roofer? What word do we use in Spanish for a roofer? I'm seeing some people say techador, techero. I'm seeing a lot of roofero. Yeah, techista. Okay. So if you look in the dictionary, you'll find the word techador. You'll find, anything related to like techo, which means roof in Spanish. But oftentimes you'll hear patients, because I interpret in medical, a lot of patients will use the word roofero for roofer. And for like someone who does sheetrock, they'll say sheetroquero. So the thing is, people will often use terms specific to their job, specific to their identities. These terms oftentimes don't show up in dictionaries. So I love that we're talking about consulting with construction workers, because that's a great way to find out what types of words that people are going to actually be using, that we might be hearing when we're interpreting. So I'm going to put this out there. People use non-binary pronouns in your language. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. How can I find out what these terms are? It's a good idea to consult sources by the people who commonly use the term in question. I'm going to seek out input from construction workers when it comes to the words they use for construction equipment. I may also consult those official sources like dictionaries, but that's only one small part of the puzzle. Why not look into other more official sources? Why not use those sources as our main source of information? I'll give you an example given to me by a dear friend who is an ASL interpreter who may or may not be in attendance. So some well-meaning folks use the sign they learned for gay, whether it be from their professor in college, another experienced interpreter, or even a deaf person who isn't gay themselves. But without even realizing it, some people, the sign that they're using turns out to be a slur, an insult. The best people to learn terminology from are the experts. And in the case of identity, the experts are the people who are that identity. It's kind of like asking a random person on the street what they would call a person who converts spoken messages from one language into another. There's probably some people walking around in my neighborhood right now. If I were to walk out and ask them, explain to them my job and ask them what my job title is, they might call me a translator. They're probably not going to use the same term that we interpreters use. But going back to gender, some of you may be saying, gender neutral language and gender neutral pronouns aren't approved by the Real Academia Española, the Spanish Language Academy. Gender neutral pronouns aren't approved by the Académie Française, the French Language Academy. I'm going to say something controversial here. So what? If the person I'm interpreting for uses a particular term that's not in the dictionary, what am I going to do? Correct them? If a patient says roofero for roofer instead of what the term that's used in the dictionary, am I going to correct them, or am I just going to interpret what they say? I will say that if you're limiting yourself at all times to only what language academies or language authorities have to say about language, you're effectively subscribing to this thing called linguistic prescriptivism. So linguistic prescriptivism is an approach to language that tells speakers how language should be used. It places values such as correct and incorrect on language and is often tied to classism, racism, colonialism, and more. Whereas linguistic descriptivism, that's descriptivism, not prescriptivism. Linguistic descriptivism is a non-judgmental approach to language that attempts to describe language as it exists in real use. It's kind of like an anthropological, sociological approach to language. And the cool thing about linguistic descriptivism is that it falls nice and neatly in line with interpreters' ethical obligation to keep our fingers on the pulse of the evolution of language. Language is power. Will you use that power for good or not? I just want to make it clear, I'm not telling anyone to change the message when they're interpreting. In fact, just the opposite. I am asking you to recognize that the things we say or do can have an unintended additional impact. And as interpreters, most of what we do, our actions, is language. If someone's message is gendered, keep it gendered. But if someone's message is gender neutral, you need to, 1, have the ability to recognize that that message is gender neutral. And 2, interpret the gender neutrality, that gender neutral spirit. If someone is making an effort to be respectful in this way and you don't interpret it, you can have a huge negative impact on the receiver of that message. It's not even just a matter of ethics. So I'm going to share with you some statistics about the health and well-being of LGBTQ folks and some of the health disparities that they face. Just a quick aside, I am very intentional here about the acronyms I will be using. Some studies I mention only include LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual participants, for instance. So yes, you will see acronyms here. And as a fair warning, I will be sharing potentially triggering information about suicide statistics in the next few slides. My suggestion to you, if you do find this information upsetting, is to practice self-care in whatever way works best for you during the next few slides, and maybe devote some time after this presentation to self-care. However, even if this is a difficult subject to hear about, I think it's very important to try your best to listen to what I have to say, because it's going to put a lot in perspective. I'm going to take a sip of water. So there is an increased suicide risk among LGBTQ youth. Now, this is due to minority stress-related experiences of stigma, discrimination, and victimization, as opposed to just being LGBTQ in and of itself. So by no means here am I saying that because someone is LGBTQ, they have an increased suicide risk. No, it's because of the stigma, discrimination, and victimization that LGBTQ folks face. LGBTQ youth are more than 4 times as likely to report attempting suicide in the past year compared to their straight or cisgender peers. 54% of trans and non-binary youth reported seriously considering suicide in the last year. 29% attempted. 48% of intersex youth seriously considered suicide in the last year. 19% attempted. And these are from 2020. When we start adding additional identities on top of LGBTQ, we start seeing that there is an impact of having multiple marginalized identities, such as being LGBTQ and a person of color, on mental health outcomes. So when we look, and these are the statistics I was able to compare against each other. If we look at the percentage of LGBTQ youth that seriously considered suicide in the past year, that percentage was at about 39%. If we look at Asian American and Pacific Islander LGBTQ youth, it goes up by 1% to 40%. If we look at deaf LGBTQ youth, we jump up to 55%. It starts to get really scary when we start looking at this here. Latinx or Hispanic LGBTQ youth who have seriously considered suicide in the past year. It says 30% more likely than just being LGBTQ by itself. So I was unclear as to whether that means 69%, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. Then if we look at Spanish-speaking LGBTQ youth, 84% seriously considered suicide in the past year because of stigma, because of discrimination, because of victimization. That's over double if someone is just LGBTQ. And then if we look at Middle Eastern and North African, it jumps up from 39% to 49%, so a 10% increase. This is serious. This is why knowing about these things, this is why being prepared to interpret for people who belong to these groups is incredibly important. So what can we do as interpreters? What's something here? What's a lesson that we can take away from this? Affirming LGBTQ youth's gender by using pronouns that align with their gender identity has been shown to improve mental health outcomes. Transgender and non-binary youth who reported having their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their lives attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronouns respected. Transgender and non-binary intersex youth who use pronouns, whose pronouns were respected by all of the people they live with had 64% lower odds of reporting a suicide attempt. And among transgender and non-binary youth, usage of their chosen name resulted in a 29% decrease in suicidal ideation and a 56% decrease in suicidal behavior for each additional context in which it was used. So what that means is if we're interpreting for someone and the name on our assignment sheet says that their name is one name, and they say that their chosen name is another name, using the name on our assignment sheet actively harms that patient if we are referring to them. But using their chosen name, it says in each additional context, it decreases suicidal ideation by 29% and suicidal behavior by 56%. So each additional context, wherever we interpret for them, that's an additional context. We can make a difference. I'm not going to mince words here. Using a person's correct pronouns and their chosen name in their language is suicide prevention. You can quote me on that. But pronouns aren't all we need to be concerned about when it comes to the effect we can have on the health and well-being of LGBTQIA+ patients. I do find that this is where a lot of people get stuck. And chances are if someone is not respecting someone's pronouns, that's the least we can ask them to do. But if someone can't respect someone's pronouns, that probably means they're doing other things to be disrespectful towards that person, a lot of times without even realizing it. Stigma-related stressors experienced by LGBTQ people can lead to disruptions in general psychological processes like coping, emotional regulation, interpersonal functioning, cognitive processes. So these in turn are thought to contribute to higher prevalence of depression, anxiety, substance use, and trauma symptoms, which can lead to poor self-care and physical health problems. So stigma-related stressors kind of set this whole thing off, set off this chain reaction. But what is stigma? Stigma is a set of negative attitudes or beliefs, kind of like biases. And we as interpreters can and do contribute to these things. And these things cause disruptions in psychological processes, which can affect LGBTQ folks' mental health and even their physical health. So what's that saying about assumptions? To assume makes an out of you and me. To assume makes the other word for donkey out of you and me. What a lot of folks don't realize is that we don't have to have malicious intent or be overtly homophobic or transphobic to add to these stressors. Many times it's something as simple as assumptions we can make that actually do harm. So we're going to do a little test. I'm going to ask you to imagine something. I really want you to set the scene in your mind, imagining the surroundings, the people, the noises, maybe even the smells. Close your eyes if it helps. And I will tell you that the situation that I'm telling you to imagine is a medical situation. My biases here as a medical interpreter are showing through, okay? But I really want you to imagine this. All right, ready? You're interpreting for a patient in a clinic. So the nurse calls the patient comes back, the nurse takes the patient's vitals. So they take their temperature, they take their blood pressure, maybe they have some small talk with the patient. They take the patient to the exam room. The doctor enters the exam room and greets the patient. And then the patient in return greets the doctor and shares their pronoun. So imagine the situation going on. Imagine the patient, imagine the doctor, imagine the nurse, or imagine the surroundings. Now, was the nurse you imagined a man or a woman? I tricked you up. You probably thought I was going to ask a different question. So a lot of people are going to imagine a woman. I certainly would in this situation. I probably would have imagined a woman as well. So this is an example of what we might call gender bias. We all have biases. It doesn't make you a bad person. So if you assumed the nurse was a woman, this is an example of a gender bias. If you assumed the doctor was a man, another example of gender bias. So I do this activity because one, I want to emphasize that we all have biases. And two, I want to point out that the first step to combat the effects of your biases and maintain impartiality is to recognize them. So some other biases, some other common examples of biases that can affect your interpretations include heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm and privileges this over any other form of sexual orientation. Cisnormativity is the assumption that cisgender is the norm and privileges this over any other form of gender identity. So these biases can and do affect the accuracy of your interpretations. If you subscribe to heteronormativity in a situation in which a woman is being asked about her spouse, if you interpret a gendered language, you might interpret this as male spouse. But spouse in English is gender neutral. Another example of a common bias that I see in interpreters is binary gender normativity. So binary gender normativity is the assumption that there are only two genders. I observe this a lot among interpreters. So I teach medical interpretation. I teach courses in medical interpretation. And in English, I will ask my students of many different languages what they might do in a situation if a patient doesn't give them a chance to interpret. And it's really interesting because I notice that the native speakers of non-gendered languages will say, well, if they don't give me a chance to interpret, whereas the native speakers of gendered languages often say, well, if he or she doesn't give me a chance to interpret. These students are paraphrasing my question, but one group is making an assumption and subscribing to binary gender normativity. When we're interpreting, we have to do our very, very best to be neutral, impartial, and accurate. Otherwise, we might end up changing the message. So if you subscribe to the bias of binary gender normativity, this will likely affect how you interpret gender neutral messages. So let's talk about how to do something about all this as interpreters. What can you do to provide more ethical and affirming interpretation services to diverse communities? These are my recommendations. As we go through each of these categories, I'd like you to identify at least three actionable things, three things you're going to do in the coming days and weeks to interpret more effectively for sexual and gender diversity, okay? So these recommendations are adapted from this really awesome study that is cited down here at the bottom of the slide. And it's specifically about how healthcare providers can better serve non-binary patients. They interviewed a bunch of non-binary folks and asked them for their input. So while the original recommendations were specifically geared towards better serving the non-binary community, they actually have a lot of really great lessons for those of us in healthcare who serve not just populations that are diverse in terms of gender and sexuality, but also diverse populations as a whole. And I dare say that these recommendations don't just apply to healthcare. So step one is to do the self-work. Engage in self-reflection. Realize that we are all monkeys on the inside. No, I'm kidding. I just thought this picture was really cute. So you want to check your biases and assumptions. You want to practice looking at people as a blank slate. Maybe the reason why you're repeatedly misgendering someone is because you're randomly memorizing pronouns instead of changing the way you think about them. And this one's super important. Develop a sense of gratitude for the emotional labor marginalized people expend to educate others. It can be exhausting to explain your existence and the struggles you face over and over again. If someone does this for you, recognize it as the precious gift it is. Don't assume, for instance, that non-binary people are obligated to explain their gender identity to you. There are so many resources available to learn about these things. Professional development cannot and should not inflict harm on others. Number two, continue to educate yourself. Recognize that you don't know everything and there is always more left to learn. Research the terms you wrote down during this presentation. I did mention in the beginning that you should be keeping a list. Don't throw that list away. And then see mistakes as learning opportunities, not as failures. If you're getting caught up in the fact that you made a mistake, like if I made a mistake during this presentation, which I'm sure I did, and I was just sitting here beating myself up over it, would I have continued with my presentation? Probably not. So dwelling on those things, not really productive. But learning from those mistakes, that's what we want to be doing. Number three, and this is a direct quote from the study I mentioned, listen to us, trust us, and commit to doing better. When I say show up to advocate, I mean both in the context of medical interpreting, because there's a specific definition of advocacy in the context of medical interpreting, and in a general context. Listen to people because, oopsies, trust that people know themselves better than you ever could. Please don't ask invasive personal questions. A better thing to do if you feel the urge to ask one is to instead look inwards and ask yourself, why is it so important for me to know? Insert embarrassing question here. Yes, clarify when necessary, but be respectful when you do. And then the fourth step of my action plan. This last bit is a kind of a mishmash of applicable recommendations from the study mentioned below, along with my own recommendations. Greet patients with non-gendered language is a great place to start. That doesn't even mean you have to use unconventional language. It can be as simple as not automatically referring to someone as sir or ma'am based on their appearance or their voice. The non-binary participants in the study actually pointed out that they felt at ease if they saw someone from their care team wearing a pride flag pin. I will say don't wear that pin unless you're actually willing to put in the work. Being an ally is not something that you call yourself. It's a verb. It's an action. It's something you have to constantly be doing. Or you can always wear something displaying your pronouns. If you're a remote interpreter, using your pronouns in your pre-session is one option. Or as I've been doing, I use my pronouns in my interjections. That's an easy way for me to increase my visibility and raise the bar. So if I'm asking for a repetition, my pronouns are she, they. So sometimes I may ask for a repetition and say, the interpreter would like to ask for a repetition. They didn't hear what you said. Sometimes I might use she, sometimes I might use they. So modeling proper pronouns through those interjections. And lastly, knowing the lingo is super important, meaning try to limit your need for clarifications by being prepared, by learning, by utilizing the resources that have been shared at multiple points, during this presentation in the chat, but I'm sure Andrew will be posting them again. So that is all that I have for you today. I know I went a little bit longer than I was originally anticipating, but I suppose I would like to turn the floor back to Analia, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
What a wonderful presentation, Kelly. Thank you very much. This is such a sensitive topic, and I appreciate your candor and your professionalism, and also just who you are. So just a beautiful person from the inside out. Thank you so much. Okay, let's hear some of the questions over here. So let's see which ones. There are several questions, so let me choose one over here. It says, can an interpreter withdraw from an assignment when she encounters an LGBT case for religious belief? FYI, I have no issue in this matter, but I have heard about some interpreters do not wish to interpret.
I really like this question. So can an interpreter withdraw from an assignment when he, she, or they encounters an LGBT case? I know for certain within medical interpreting, our codes of ethics actually request this. If we ever encounter that we have a conflict of interest, the first thing that medical interpreters should do, because as a medical interpreter, I can only speak on the codes of ethics for medical interpreters, a medical interpreter should announce the conflict of interest and potentially withdraw from the assignment if necessary. And I fully support anyone who thinks that they cannot remain impartial. Honestly, I would rather, and I'm sure that, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm sure in many cases, the person you're interpreting for who is a member of the LGBTQ community would much rather not have you as their interpreter than have you as their interpreter and you misgendering them or bringing your biases to the table. So absolutely, I think that is something that, and I think more language service companies should be understanding of this and allow these things to occur. Because I do find that that is usually the issue, is with the company allowing it to happen versus the interpreter making that decision.
Right, and I am glad, Kelly, you mentioned that. So always check with the company that you work for. If you work for a company, how they would like to act based on what you're encountering, right? So always check with your company. Okay, so the next one is, do you have a source of glossary for all these terms in other languages?
It's funny, Analia, you and I were just talking about
Yes,
glossaries.
we did.
I'm personally, I will say I'm not a big fan of glossaries simply because, especially multilingual glossaries, because usually it might be like maybe one language is kind of good and then the other languages might not be as well researched. I recommend for terms in these languages, in different languages, I do have the resources that Andrew shared in the chat. There's a section on my page for LGBTQIA resources on my website that has non-English resources. I don't have every language represented there. I can't personally screen resources that are in languages other than my working languages, which are English and Spanish. I can also, to some degree, review some French resources because French was my second language. But I have to have kind of vetted those resources. So I don't have a glossary that has, a term and then that same term in like 5 different languages. My recommendation, as I stated during the presentation, is to go to these communities. Oftentimes there are websites and organizations, which are also included on my LGBTQIA resources page, that they will show you proper usage of the language. And kind of following by their example, I think is a really, really useful resource.
Thank you, Kelly. Here's another question. I understand this presentation targets mostly interpreters. What resources would you, Kelly, recommend for translators? Written language in general needs to be more prescriptive than descriptive.
Yes, I can understand that. And normally when I do this presentation, I actually have a slide about prescriptivism and how prescriptivism, there are some instances in which prescriptivism is important, like critical equipment manuals and things like that. So I completely understand that, it's not black and white. It's not,
Mhm.
prescriptivism evil, descriptivism good. There's always a gray area in between, right? So for translators, I think honestly, many of those same resources on my LGBTQIA resources page. I also have a page on inclusive language resources. So part of one of the sections on the inclusive language resources page is on gender and sexual diversity. I include some resources. The UN actually has really good resources for managing gender in language. I actually have one right up on my screen right now that's linked on my inclusive language page. And in addition, I will be giving a class in May of next year with cross-cultural communications on interpreting inclusive language. However, many of those recommendations will also be applicable to translators. And that will actually be a 4-hour class. So that's really exciting. I'll be able to cover more than just gender neutral language and pronouns, which is only part of the huge umbrella of inclusive language.
Thank you, Kelly. Before I go to the next question, I want to let our audience know that if you need to leave the encounter right now, the encounter, like the interpreter
Encounter.
encounter, right? The webinar, you could do so. You already fulfilled your hour of being here, and we do want to thank everybody for your participation. And Kelly, I do want to be respectful of your time. Do you feel like you can
I
answer
can
a couple
stay.
of questions? Okay.
I'm good.
So everybody else, if you need to leave, please know that you are okay leaving. And Kelly, thank you so much for your kindness. Okay, so let's see. Let me go to a different question. How do you balance being impartial as a medical interpreter when a patient's family member misgenders them during an interpreting session, knowing how harmful this can be to the patient's mental health and well-being? I have already decided how to handle this in a way that aligns with my morals and ethics. Just thought it would be an interesting question to pose to the group. Thank you for taking on the labor of explaining this topic to an audience that has maybe never knowingly even met an LGBTQ plus person. So back to the question at the beginning, how do you balance being impartial as a medical interpreter when a patient's family member misgenders them during an interpreting session, knowing how harmful this can be to the patient's mental health and well-being?
I'm smiling because I absolutely love this question.
Mhm.
Um, this is actually something that, again, in the full version of this presentation, I actually do cover this. So I will say that the majority of the times that I have interpreted for folks who are openly LGBTQ have been in mental health settings. And 99 times out of 100 that I've been in a situation where the family member is misgendering the other family member, the provider will interject. So in which case I can kind of hands up, hands off, just kind of let it play out. And if we're talking about specifically medical or healthcare interpretation, I use the terms interchangeably, medical and healthcare, because I'm both a certified medical interpreter and a certified healthcare interpreter. But um, we have to remember the ethical principle of advocacy as outlined by the NCIHC that says if the patient's health, well-being, or dignity is at risk, we may be justified in acting as an advocate. So I think if a family member is relentlessly misgendering their family member, yes, that can certainly inflict harm. I would say that's dignity, mental well-being. Even we've seen how this can affect their physical well-being. But we first have to try those less intrusive means first, meaning we have to let people know that there's a problem first. So what I might do in that situation, if the family member is repeatedly misgendering the patient, I will of course interpret accurately, but I will raise my hand and interject and say, excuse me, this is the interpreter speaking. I just wanted to make it clear that the patient's pronouns are they, them. That is my understanding that the patient's pronouns are they, them. And just kind of putting it out there. And then from there, you can make your informed decision about how to proceed further. I don't think that it is outside the realm of possibility to advocate in a situation where a patient is being misgendered. In fact, when we start looking at hopefully the the Department of Health and Human Services will release their final rule of Section 1557, in which healthcare providers, it will actually be considered discrimination to misgender a patient relentlessly so, like that. So in those situations, we might even have the backing of the law with that as well. But we're still waiting on those. They said they'd have them by
Right.
the end of the year, but maybe we'll see them in 2024.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, here's another one. I agree with everything you are saying, but my question is, in my interpreting experience, our LGBTQ plus patients don't use and even less insist on pronouns. That's how deep the binary gender normative runs in the culture. I guess it's more
Um,
like a comment.
yeah, I will say, my experience, I can't disagree with that to some degree. I will say that, there are definitely folks who I've interpreted for who have been non-binary native Spanish speakers. And I've even interpreted for cisgender heterosexual patients where someone else in the room is introducing themselves with their pronouns, and they introduce themselves as, hi, my name is so and so, and my pronouns are they, them. And I interpret this into Spanish using the pronoun ella, which is the generally recognized singular gender neutral they in Spanish by folks whose those are their pronouns. And I've actually had people thank me for interpreting those pronouns as ella from
Mhm.
cisgender heterosexual Spanish speakers. So I think even if we don't find ourselves interpreting specifically for someone who might use non-binary pronouns, I think that knowledge is increasing. And like I said, I've been thanked by cisgender heterosexual patients for interpreting,
Mhm.
and native Spanish speakers for interpreting pronouns, the singular they.
Thank you, Kelly. Here's a short one. It says, how do you introduce yourself without saying ma'am or sir or Mr., Mrs. or Mr.?
This is a great question because I actually worked for an interpreting agency that had as part of my script, part of my pre-session, that I had to assign a gender. I had to say ma'am or sir to the person I was
Mm.
talking to based on their voice. I was doing over the phone interpreting. And it's tough because I talked to the agency and I said, this is really problematic. You're making me assume someone's, honorifics and basically their gender by their voice, which is not accurate at all.
Mhm.
And they came back to me and said, well, you got to stick to the script. And I actually deviated from the script, got in trouble for deviating from the script. And then they came back to me and they were like, you got to stick to the script. Otherwise, you're not going to get calls. And I was like, okay. So I stuck to the script, and I felt horrible about it. Repeatedly, I did on a couple of occasions misgender people. I called a ma'am a sir, and a sir a ma'am because of the way that their voices sound.
Mhm.
So I think just completely eliminating the sir or ma'am, I think it's entirely possible. I don't use sir or ma'am when I'm interpreting unless I know for certain that that person is a sir or a ma'am. And I managed to get, I'm very highly requested as an interpreter for my professionalism and for, not to toot my own horn here, but for being polite. And, I think there is a way to be polite with your tone of voice. There's a
Yes.
way to be polite with your facial expressions if you have that available to you. And, even just asking someone for something instead of saying, can you do this for me? You say, would you be so kind as to, or in return, I would be happy to if you would. There are so many different ways to add pleasantries to your language other than assigning sir or ma'am.
Yes. And Kelly, here's just one final question for you. And the person really wanted me to ask you this.
Mhm.
So I'm making this the last
Okay.
question. What is the proper pronoun to use for a pregnant trans man if that is not defined by the patient?
If it's not defined by the patient, I would
Yes. So,
normally switch to third person and ask the patient what their pronouns are. That's
mhm.
my go-to, is to interject and ask what their pronouns are. If I have not heard, usually the way that I gather people's pronouns when I'm interpreting is oftentimes, like it was mentioned before, a lot of times people don't introduce themselves with their pronouns. But I usually hear either the provider talking about the patient using pronouns, and then the patient can either correct those
Mhm.
pronouns or go along with those pronouns, in which case I'll follow the provider's lead. Of course, as a medical interpreter, I'm going to use the terms provider and patient.
Right.
And then the patient, if they're speaking about themselves, sometimes you'll hear them use adjectives, the gendered adjectives in Spanish. That gives me a clue into their pronouns. I never assume someone's pronouns. I
Mhm.
always make sure to clarify, switch to third person. Excuse me, this is the interpreter speaking. Would you be able to tell me what your pronouns are? Something along
Yes.
those lines, and then interpret it to the other language to be transparent. That's always the
Mhm.
best bet. Never assume someone's pronouns, because you can always have
Yes.
folks who are like a cisgender woman and they might not use she, her pronouns. So gender
Mhm.
and pronouns also don't always have that one-to-one either.
Yes. Thank you so much. And everyone, we're going to let Kelly go. She has been very kind to give us some extra 11 minutes. So, Kelly, with this, thank you very much for presenting today. Wonderful, beautiful, very meticulous, very elaborated, just very sensitive, well presented topic. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of our heart from CCC that you are here today. And I personally can't wait to be with you on May 11th for your workshop. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you, Analia. Thank you so much. And your outfit is so gorgeous today. You're
Thank
so
you.
gorgeous today. I just want to say that.
Thank you. Thank you, Panama.